When you finally stop talking to someone with an avoidant attachment style, something powerful begins to shift, both in you and in them. At first, it feels like silence is a last resort, a painful necessity after trying everything to be seen, understood, and valued. But what most people don't realize is that your absence initiates a psychological chain reaction inside an avoidant's mind. It's not instant, it's not obvious, it's not loud, but it is real, and once it starts, it's very hard for them to escape. What you're about to understand is not just a sequence of events, it's the emotional unraveling that happens when someone who fears closeness starts to feel the consequences of losing the one person who offered them safety without demanding anything they couldn't give. In the beginning, when the silence first settles in, they may look calm on the surface, even relieved. This part hurts the most for you, because it seems like you walked away and nothing changed for them. They act like the space is peaceful, like they can finally breathe, like they were drowning in the closeness you offered. But what looks like relief is actually a fragile emotional defense mechanism. Avoidants have trained themselves to feel safer without attachment, because attachment to them has always equaled pain. So when you stop talking, they slip into a mode where they convince themselves that distance is better. It's the only way they know to quiet the discomfort they feel when emotions get too close. But what they don't tell you, what they may not even tell themselves, is that the feeling of relief always comes with an expiration date. It is temporary, fragile, and artificial. It is the first reaction, not the final one. And as the silence continues, cracks begin to form. The first crack happens in the quiet moments they didn't prepare for. Maybe it's late at night, or during a routine task, or when they scroll through their phone and instinctively expect a message from you, only to find nothing. These moments are small, but they land directly in the place they've spent their lives trying to protect. At first it's just a flicker, a tiny, almost invisible pang of regret. They don't call it regret, of course. They label it as habit, curiosity, or just a passing thought. But deep inside, something stirs, something they don't have control over. This is the moment where the silence starts working. Because for someone who has always found safety in distance, the reality of actual distance is different than the fantasy. When they were the ones pulling away, it felt safe, like they were protecting themselves. But when you stop talking, the power dynamic shifts. Suddenly the silence isn't theirs. It isn't something they created. It's something they're forced to feel. And that is where the discomfort begins. What they feel next is nostalgia. Raw, unexpected, uncontrollable nostalgia. Not for the big moments, but for the tiny ones. The way you laughed, the way you spoke their name, the way you understood them without demanding an emotional performance. These memories don't show up gently. They appear like flashes, like pieces of a movie they can't stop watching. And every time they try to brush them away, another one surfaces. This is because avoidants don't process emotions in real time. They suppress them until the person they care about is no longer available. Only then do the suppressed emotions begin to leak out. It starts subtly. They begin remembering your voice at random times. They catch themselves imagining what you're doing now. They start thinking about the last conversation you had, wondering if they misunderstood it, or if they pushed too hard, or if you meant something deeper than you said. This nostalgia isn't romantic fantasy, it's emotional unraveling, because now in the silence they can no longer hide behind the distance they used as protection. They begin to feel the very thing they tried to avoid. Then comes the internal war. This is the part where they start questioning themselves. They want to reach out, but pride interrupts. They think of sending a message, but fear stops them. They begin to overanalyze everything, what you said, what they didn't say, whether you're upset, whether you've moved on, whether it's too late. Their mind becomes a battlefield, attachment pulling them toward you, fear pushing them away. In this stage, they try to convince themselves they don't care, because caring feels unsafe. They tell themselves that you were too emotional, too close, too demanding, even if that's not true. They rewrite the story in their head to protect themselves from the vulnerability of missing you. And yet, despite all their mental gymnastics, they cannot escape the fact that your silence feels heavier than the closeness they once ran from. Your absence is starting to matter. This is when curiosity takes over. Quietly, secretly, and from a distance, they check your online activity, not because they want you to know, but because they want to feel connected without risking rejection. They open your profile. They scroll through your posts, they look at your stories without interacting, they even pay attention to the people who engage with your content. This isn't casual curiosity, it's emotional surveillance, a way to monitor you while pretending they don't care. And with each silent check, another layer of their defenses begins to crumble. The panic phase begins when they realize they no longer know what you're feeling. Avoidants don't fear losing people, they fear needing people. But the moment they notice they don't have the access they once did, something unfamiliar rises inside them. It's not desperation, not yet, it's more like a shadow of anxiety. A subtle but persistent thought, what if you're really gone this time? They begin to replay your last interactions, searching for clues. They remember moments where you pulled away slightly, and they wonder if that was the beginning. They think about the times they didn't respond properly, and suddenly those moments feel louder. They start noticing how empty conversations feel without your presence layered beneath them. They become aware of how they never truly appreciated the emotional space you created for them. And now, another realization hits. They are no longer in control. This is the moment everything shifts. Because avoidants avoid, not because they don't care, but because they fear the vulnerability that comes with caring. But the fear of losing you becomes bigger than the fear of closeness, and that creates an emotional conflict, intense enough to break through their defense system. This is where regret begins to form, not as a dramatic epiphany, but as a slow, steady ache. Not a regret of who you were, but a regret of what they didn't allow themselves to be with you. They start thinking about how you were patient, how you listened, how you stayed even when they didn't give you the consistency you deserved. Suddenly your value becomes sharper, clearer. They begin to understand that the connection you offered wasn't something ordinary, it was something rare, something calm, something secure, something they cannot replicate easily, especially with the emotional walls they've built. They might not act on these feelings yet. Avoidants don't rush back quickly. Their emotions surface slowly, like water rising behind a dam, but the silence that once felt comforting now begins to feel suffocating. They start imagining what you're feeling. They start picturing you moving on. They wonder if someone else is giving you the softness, the attention, the presence they took for granted. And with every thought, the emotional pressure inside them builds. This is when the loneliness wave hits, not the ordinary kind. The deep, echoing kind that comes from realizing they pushed away someone who genuinely cared. They feel it in quiet rooms, in empty moments, in the stillness of their own company. Your silence amplifies everything they suppressed. Every fear, every longing, every mistake. They begin questioning themselves. They wonder why they acted the way they did. Why they couldn't be more present. Why they always run when things get real, and even though they won't show this vulnerability, it starts to shape their behavior. By this point, the nostalgia is no longer mild. It's strong, persistent, and emotionally intrusive. They miss your energy, your softness, your presence. They miss the emotional safety you offered, something they rarely experience with anyone else. And for the first time, they begin to realize that distance did not protect them. It only heightened the feelings they tried to escape. This is the emotional blueprint of an avoidant beginning to come back after you stop talking. It is slow, internal, conflicted, and deeply emotional. And though they may not reach out yet, the internal shift has begun. The stage is set, the silence is working, and each day that passes pulls them closer to confronting the feelings they've spent a lifetime running from. And just when it seems like they might finally reach out, something inside them pulls back again. This is where the ego steps in, quiet but powerful, whispering reasons to stay silent. They begin asking themselves questions they don't want to answer honestly. What if you don't respond? What if you've already moved on? What if reaching out makes them look weak? For someone who has built their identity around emotional independence, the idea of needing you becomes almost unbearable. So instead of acting on what they feel, they hesitate, they stall, they sit in the tension between desire and fear, hoping somehow the feeling will fade on its own. But it doesn't fade, it grows. They replay scenarios in their mind, imagining how a conversation might go, imagining your tone, your reaction, your distance, and every version of that imagined reality carries risk. So they do what they've always done. When emotions get too intense, they retreat inward. They tell themselves it's not the right time. They convince themselves that silence is safer. But beneath all of that, something undeniable continues to build: the need to reconnect. This is the stage where their behavior becomes confusing if you could see it from the outside. One moment they feel close to reaching out, the next they shut the idea down completely. It's not because they don't care, it's because caring has now become too real. At the same time, they begin paying closer attention to your digital presence. Not casually, but intentionally. Your silence has created a gap, and they try to fill that gap with observation. They watch your stories. They notice when you post. They analyze the tone of your captions, the people interacting with you, even the timing of your activity. They're searching for clues, trying to understand where you are emotionally, without having to ask directly. Every detail becomes meaningful to them. If you seem happy, they feel a subtle sting. If you seem distant, they wonder if it's because of them. If you post less, they question whether something deeper is happening. And all of this happens silently, without you even knowing they're paying attention. Because this is how they maintain control, by observing instead of engaging. But the more they observe, the less control they actually feel. Because now, they're no longer just watching. You're starting to feel unreachable. And that's when the emotional pressure intensifies. A new kind of discomfort begins to settle in. It's not just about missing you anymore. It's about losing access to you. The realization that they can't simply return whenever they feel like it begins to shake something inside them. For a long time, they were used to knowing you were there. Even when they pulled away, even when they created distance, there was always a quiet certainty that you hadn't disappeared completely. But now, that certainty is gone. And that's where the panic begins to rise, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. It shows up in small, intrusive thoughts. What if this silence isn't temporary? What if you've truly let go this time? What if they misjudged how much you were willing to tolerate? These questions don't leave them easily. They linger, they repeat, they grow stronger with time. This is the moment where the illusion of control starts to break, because for the first time, they are not choosing the distance you are. And that shift changes everything. They begin to feel something unfamiliar, emotional vulnerability without protection. There is no distraction strong enough to fully suppress it. They try to keep themselves busy. They dive into routines. They seek comfort in distractions. But your absence follows them. It shows up in quiet pauses, in empty spaces, in the moments where their mind is left alone with itself. And in those moments, they begin to feel the weight of what they've lost. Still, instead of immediately reaching out, they try one more defense mechanism: rationalization. They attempt to rewrite the story in a way that makes their silence feel justified. They tell themselves that maybe the connection wasn't that deep, that maybe it wouldn't have worked anyway, that maybe you were too much, or too emotional, or too demanding. But these thoughts don't bring relief. They feel forced, unnatural, incomplete. Because no matter how much they try to reshape the narrative, the emotional truth keeps breaking through. If it didn't matter, they wouldn't still be thinking about you. If it wasn't real, they wouldn't feel this pull. If they truly didn't care, your silence wouldn't feel this heavy. And slowly, that realization begins to settle in. What they feel next is loneliness, but not the kind they're used to. Avoidants are comfortable being alone. They often prefer it. But this loneliness is different. It's not about being by themselves. It's about feeling the absence of a specific person who brought something into their life that they can't easily replace. It's the absence of emotional understanding. It's the absence of someone who saw them beyond their walls. It's the absence of someone who stayed, even when they made it difficult. And that absence begins to echo. They notice it when they talk to other people and the conversations feel surface level. They notice it when they try to connect with someone new and it doesn't feel the same. They notice it when they laugh at something and instinctively think of sharing it with you, only to remember they can't. And that's when comparison begins. Without even trying, they start comparing others to you. Not in a conscious, intentional way, but naturally. They notice how rare your patience was, how different your energy felt, how you created a space where they didn't feel pressured, even when they were distant. And suddenly, what they once took for granted becomes something they struggle to find again. This comparison deepens the emotional impact of your absence, because now it's not just about missing you, it's about realizing your value. And that realization leads to another powerful emotional trigger: jealousy. It doesn't have to be obvious. It doesn't require proof. Even the possibility that you might be moving on is enough to activate it. A new person in your comments, a subtle change in your behavior, a sense that your energy is no longer tied to them. These small signals are enough to create a strong emotional reaction inside them. Because now they are forced to confront something they've been avoiding this entire time, the idea that you might choose someone else, and that thought unsettles them deeply. Not because they feel entitled to you, but because they're beginning to understand what losing you actually means. It's no longer a distant possibility. It's becoming real, tangible, frighteningly permanent, and with that realization, something inside them shifts again. The emotional walls they've lived behind for so long begin to weaken, not all at once, not dramatically, but just enough for the truth to seep in. Enough for them to feel what they've been avoiding. Enough for them to recognize that their silence is no longer protecting them, it's costing them something they may never get back. This is when they start thinking about reaching out in subtle, indirect ways. Not openly, not boldly, but cautiously, the way someone touches a warm door before opening it. They might watch your story, like a post, interact with something you shared, anything tiny that gives them a glimpse of how you might respond without exposing themselves fully. And even that small action takes enormous emotional effort for them, because at this stage nothing feels certain. They don't know where your heart stands. They don't know if you're open, guarded, or completely done. They don't know if their absence hurt you or healed you. And that uncertainty is foreign territory for them, because they usually avoid emotional risk at all costs. But despite the fear, despite the hesitation, despite the storm of doubt building inside them, one thing has become undeniable. Your silence has changed them. It has forced them to feel what they once numbed. It has made them confront emotional truths they once escaped. It has made them realize that losing you is not something they can brush aside. They are no longer running from the connection. They are slowly turning back toward it. And even if they haven't reached out yet, the direction of their heart is already moving. Because once an avoidant begins to feel this deeply, there is no going back to pretending they don't care. There is only forward, through fear, through resistance, and eventually, toward you. What comes next is the stage no one talks about, the one where the avoidant doesn't just feel the loss, they begin to understand it. Their emotions, once quiet and manageable, now rise to the surface with a force they can't suppress. The silence that once comforted them now suffocates them. They're left alone with their memories of you, memories that suddenly feel more precious, more vivid, more painful than before. They remember how you were patient with them even when they shut down. They remember how you tried to love them in soft, gentle ways. They remember how your presence made them feel safe, even if they never admitted it. And now they can't understand why they pushed that away. This realization hurts them more than they expected, because it forces them to see the moments where you reached out and they stayed silent, the moments where you needed reassurance and they went distant, the moments where you gave love and they gave hesitation. They see everything now, not with detachment, but with remorse, and avoidants don't process remorse dramatically. It shows up as a quiet ache that grows heavier the longer they sit with it. That quiet ache becomes emotional accountability. They start realizing their avoidance wasn't harmless self-protection. It had consequences. It hurt you. It damaged the connection. It prevented a future that could have existed if they weren't afraid of closeness. And this realization becomes the seed of their transformation. They replay every boundary you tried to communicate, every moment you expressed your needs, every time you told them how their distance affected you. Back then they brushed it aside because facing those truths would have required emotional responsibility they weren't ready for. But now your words echo differently. They hear the love behind them, the vulnerability in them, the longing beneath them. They hear how gently you tried to create closeness, and for the first time they understand that you weren't asking for too much. You weren't being demanding. You weren't overwhelming. You were simply asking to be loved in a way that didn't require you to sacrifice yourself. This realization shatters them internally. It forces them to see the truth. They pushed away someone who tried to meet them where they were. Someone who didn't ask for perfection, only presence. Someone who didn't need emotional intensity, just emotional honesty. They sit with this truth, and it stings in a way they can't ignore. This is the stage where the vulnerable overthinking begins. They replay conversations. They analyze every detail. They wonder if you were hurting more than you showed. They wonder if you stayed longer than you should have. They wonder if you felt alone even while loving them. They type messages they never send. "I'm sorry I hurt you. I didn't understand what I had. I miss you." They delete them, then write them again. then delete them again, because vulnerability still terrifies them. But the fact that they're even thinking about saying these things is proof of how deeply your silence has affected them. This is the moment where the fear of losing you forever becomes real enough to push them toward action, slowly, hesitantly, but undeniably. Before they reach out, they enter a phase of emotional preparation. They rehearse conversations, they script messages, they imagine scenarios, they overanalyze timing, tone, response, risk. What if you're angry? What if you ignore them? What if you're polite but distant? What if someone else is in your life now? These fears battle inside them, creating a new kind of paralysis, not the avoidance of emotion, but the fear of emotional consequence. Yet beneath all that fear is the same undeniable truth. They want to reconnect, and each day that desire grows stronger. They imagine your reaction. They imagine hearing your voice again. They imagine the possibility of repairing what was lost. And even though they're scared, that hope becomes the final push they need. They won't reach out dramatically. They won't confess everything at once. But when they finally do, it will be honest. It will be real. It will be the beginning of a return, not built on habit or convenience, but on genuine emotional awakening. Behind their simple message will be the entire emotional storm they've been battling alone. Every regret, every realization, every moment of missing you that they never spoke aloud. They're not just reaching out, they're reaching back to the connection they ran from, back to the person they never stopped thinking about, back to the emotional truth they're finally ready to face. And the next stages will reveal what happens when the avoidant finally stops running and begins choosing the connection they almost lost forever. What happens next is the most fragile and emotionally exposing stage of the entire journey, because this is when the avoidant finally reaches the point they've spent their whole life running from. This is where the truth inside them becomes louder than the fear, louder than the ego, louder than the walls they believed would always keep them safe. Everything they've felt until now, the longing, the regret, the realizations, the comparisons, the overthinking, has lived silently inside their mind. But the weight of carrying all of that alone becomes too heavy, and in that heaviness, something begins to shift. Not dramatically, but slowly, like the first stretch of light breaking through a dark horizon. They start to see their own patterns clearly for the first time. They realize their avoidance was never strength. It was fear disguised as control. Their silence wasn't protection. It was escape, dressed up as independence. Their distance wasn't indifference. It was emotional panic, hidden behind composure. And in that clarity, they finally admit that pushing you away had nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with emotions they never learned to face. But now something inside them flips. The fear of closeness becomes smaller than the fear of losing you forever. That shift is their breakthrough. Suddenly staying silent doesn't feel safe. It feels painful. Missing you doesn't feel manageable. It feels like the consequence of choices they wish they could undo. They start imagining a different version of themselves, someone who doesn't run when feelings deepen, someone who doesn't shut down when emotions get real, someone who actually shows up. These thoughts stop being fantasies and start becoming intentions. They think about the patience you offered, the understanding you gave, and the way you loved them even when they didn't know how to let love in. And desire begins to replace fear, desire to repair, desire to reconnect, desire to show you the part of them they hid behind avoidance. Even then, reaching out feels terrifying. Their mind floods with questions. What if you ignore them? What if they waited too long? What if you moved on? What if their chance is already gone? These fears don't stop them, but they slow them, making them hesitate, rethink and replay every scenario. And then finally, the moment comes when the silence feels heavier than vulnerability, when missing you hurts more than the fear of reaching out, when the risk of losing you becomes unbearable. This is the turning point. They pick up their phone, their heart pounding because for once they feel they truly have something to lose. They stare at your name, they type, delete, retype. Their chest tightens, their breath shortens, and then something inside whispers, just try. The message they send won't be long or dramatic. It will be small, cautious, soft. Hey, how have you been? Or I've been thinking about you. Or can we talk? It looks simple, but behind it is every emotion they battled in silence, every regret, every missed moment, every realization they never voiced. That message isn't small, it is everything. And once it's sent, they enter a stage they rarely experience, waiting. Waiting for your response, waiting for hope, waiting to know if something they broke can be repaired. Every minute feels longer than it should. Every unread message feels heavier than their heart can hold. For the first time, they sit in vulnerability without control, exposed, uncertain, afraid, fully aware of how much you mattered. Your silence becomes the same mirror they once forced you to look into. It teaches them what their own silence cost. It shows them that they cared more than they ever admitted, and slowly, this opens something inside them. They begin to show effort, expression, and presence, imperfect but sincere. Eventually, they reach the moment they feared most, real communication. And this is where the truths they buried finally surface. I should have shown up better. I didn't know how to handle my feelings. I pushed you away because I was scared. You meant more to me than I allowed myself to feel. These aren't manipulative lines. They're confessions, raw, vulnerable truths from a heart that has finally cracked open. And after everything, the regret, the clarity, the fear, the longing, they reach the emotional crossroads they once avoided. They choose connection over fear. They choose vulnerability over distance. They choose to try. What happens next is up to your boundaries and healing. But one thing is certain, their return isn't random or convenient. It's emotional, it's intentional, it's born from longing, reflection, fear, and the painful realization that they could not forget you. You weren't too much. You weren't the problem. You were the one who awakened the part of them they spent their life avoiding. The one they lost. The one they want back. The one their silence taught them to value. This is what it truly looks like when an avoidant comes back after you stop talking to them, slowly, quietly, vulnerably, and with a heart finally opening toward the connection they once ran from.